A deadly assignment to expose a con. A deranged doctor spinning out of control. A shocking murder that no one saw coming. And a critical clue that leads directly to death row. Dr. Michos' story begins in the spring of 2000, when investigators are alerted to his suspiciously large income.
I think a podiatrist in our town probably makes maybe a little over $100,000.
Investigators delve into Michos' business activities to uncover how he is making so much money from podiatry. Agents scour Michos' financial records to identify the source of his revenue. They discover the majority of his elderly patients are signed up to the US Medicare program.
Medicare is a system, and the money is paid by the federal government to allow people who are elderly or perhaps don't have a lot of money, so it gets subsidized.
It quickly becomes clear how Michos is making so much money. He's billing the Medicare program for hundreds of thousands of dollars, far more than an average Chicago podiatrist.
It just seemed very excessive. Once we understood exactly what procedures were being billed, they just seemed very, very excessive. Just looking at it on paper, before we even talked to anyone, it seemed unbelievable.
Investigators suspect Dr. Michos is swindling Medicare by billing for procedures he hasn't performed.
If there's nothing wrong with your feet, if you don't have any real problem, you're not going to see your podiatrist several times a month. And Dr. Michos was submitting, at some point, these bills for the same patients and reiterated over and over and over again. And if you believed he was doing what he said he did, then these patients would have to be seeing him several times a month, which is obviously absurd.
To add to investigators' suspicions, there are no patient records, no prescriptions, and no records for any medication. Just a multitude of bills for multiple surgical procedures.
95% of the work was through Medicare, if not 100%. This was his bank. Medicare was his bank.
Investigators decide to take charge. They suspend all Medicare payments to Michos while they look into each case. Autumn 2001. Investigators continue to amass evidence that Chicago podiatrist Dr. Ronald Michos is defrauding the federal Medicare system of hundreds of thousands of dollars. After suspending his payments, they turn up the heat and call in FBI Special Agent Mary Beth King.
The more I learned about it, I became more and more invested in making sure that we were able to prove that Ronald Michos was in fact committing Medicare fraud, that he was stealing money, that he knew that he was submitting claims that were not true.
Investigators request Michos attend a meeting at the U.S. Attorney's Office.
We didn't believe any of these services were being done, so we wanted to see what he had in his files.
After months of inquiries, the investigators finally come face to face with their suspected fraudster.
What we wanted to achieve from the meeting was, is he going to be honest with us and tell us, look, I screwed up, I made some mistakes, but instead, we got the exact opposite.
Under questioning, Michos' demeanor swings wildly from one extreme to the other.
Michos' mood, it just seemed to change and fluctuate throughout the meeting. It looked like he would almost smile one minute and then get really angry the next minute. And what we did throughout the meeting was we brought up certain patient names and asked him about certain patients and said, did you do all of these services for this particular patient? And each and every time he said, yes, he did.
The investigators confront Michos about the huge catalog of suspect billings over several years. He flatly denies committing fraud.
We felt he was lying the whole time with each and every patient that we brought up. And the service.
Investigators begin building their case. The documental evidence is strong, but the team needs more.
in these kinds of cases, while the paperwork in and of itself is good evidence, you really need, in a grand jury or certainly a trial, you need live testimony. You need victims to get on the stand and basically say, he did not perform 300 surgeries on me. He did not perform any surgeries on me. What he did was cut my toenails.
Investigators visit Maikos' clients and interview them about the procedures he performed on their feet. But it quickly becomes obvious none of them want to discuss their podiatrist.
We were attempting to do our interviews and talking to patients, and they would get very angry with us, and we just didn't understand why. We realized that there was a really strong loyalty that they had to Dr. Maikos.
After weeks of interviews, investigators find not one patient willing to dish the dirt.
It was very frustrating, and all we kept doing was just going back to our patient list to see if there was anyone we could talk to. We just kept trying, but we were constantly frustrated by it.
There was a chance that an individual who was knowingly defrauding Medicare for millions of dollars, that he comes and performs services for you on your feet, and if all else fails, tell them you're tired, you don't want to
Unaware
talk
of the doctor's descent into addiction, the investigators face their own problems. They're still unable to find anyone willing to tell the truth about their podiatrist's fraud. And to make matters worse, the list of potential witnesses is dwindling. Many of Maikos' elderly or sick patients died before the investigation started.
It became very difficult to try to find a finite number of patients that existed in the first place, and that number, as time went on, just kept getting smaller and smaller.
Frustrated investigators know the case is in danger of collapse.
When you're in a situation where you know an individual has so blatantly stolen money from the federal government, it becomes incredibly difficult to believe that they might walk away from that and we wouldn't be able to charge them with a crime. It is incredibly frustrating and something that I thought about every single night. How do we make this happen?
Investigators redouble their efforts. They dig deep in Maikos' files to some of his earliest patients. After a few days of intensive research, they make a critical breakthrough.
And she slowly came to the door and spoke with her. I just got the sense that she was very easy to talk to, very kind.
Ill health has forced Brannon to take early retirement from her nursing job. A devout Christian, she is now caretaker at the church above her apartment. She remembers Maikos. When Reyes revealed he had billed Medicare for 70 surgical procedures on her feet, she is stunned.
When I first met Joyce and I explained to her what these types of surgeries were billed to Medicare, I remember she raised her hand and she said, "Honey, I'm a former ICU nurse. I know exactly what you're talking about, and these didn't happen." So she knew exactly what was going on.
Brannon confirms that Maikos didn't carry out a single surgical procedure on her feet. She agrees to testify. It's a decision that will have tragic consequences.
Trying to get someone to come before the grand jury, and it appeared that all of that hard work was finally coming to fruition.
Initially, I didn't know what to think. I was completely shocked and just very angry and hurt by it.
Investigators are convinced Maikos is a fraudster. But does he have what it takes to be a cold-blooded killer? They scour his background to uncover any evidence that might suggest he could be capable of homicide. It's now that they learn the shocking extent of Maikos' drug dependency, but they know that the toughest part of the investigation is still to come. They now need solid testimony confirming Maikos is guilty not only of fraud, but also of homicide.
You know, for us, we thought the Medicare portion of the investigation was pretty obvious. With the murder part, our concern was that all we had was circumstantial evidence.
Still lack any kind of physical evidence linking the podiatrist to Brannon's killing.
We're concerned Because the standard of proof is so high in court, would circumstantial evidence be enough for us without finding that direct link?
If they can't locate the gun, Dr. Ronald Michaels could get away with murder. Investigators believe that Michaels disposed of the gun after killing Brannan, but now they have to prove it in a court of law.
As an investigative team, we had a huge responsibility to Joyce's family. We wanted to do what was right, and we were really hoping that the jury would also make the right decision.
In court, prosecutors lay out the evidence and present the timeline of events that would end in Joyce Brannan's murder. They claim Michaels' life falls apart following suspension's deception.
You can piece it together from his girlfriends, you can piece it together from the manic way he was behaving in seeing where the agents were going, tracking what they were saying. He was very involved in not going to jail.
And just very, very grateful to the jury for their decision.
It's difficult to describe the feeling of being in the courtroom when the jury reads its verdict. And I couldn't help but think about Joyce's mother, who was still alive.
We look at doctors and medical professions as pillars of the community. You trust them, that's what you're brought up to do. When something like this happens, it shakes your faith in the whole profession.
He was a coward for what he did. You know, he saw Joyce as a huge threat. All she wanted to do was tell the truth and just not lie and just do the right thing. He felt completely threatened by that. So to do what he did is just extreme cowardice.